The morning of April 17th, 1847, dawned with a thick London fog that clung to the windows of Isabella Munro's bedchamber like ghostly fingers. The mist seemed to hold the world in suspension, as if nature itself was holding its breath for the momentous day ahead. In the east wing of the Munro estate, servants had been bustling since before dawn, carrying heated water for the bride's bath, pressing linens, and arranging flowers that had arrived from the Richmond hothouse the previous evening. Isabella stood perfectly still before the ornate looking-glass as her lady's maid, Martha, secured the final pearl buttons of her wedding gown. The creation was a masterpiece of ivory silk, imported from Lyon, and Belgian lace so delicate it appeared to float around her slender figure. 6 months of work by London's finest seamstresses had culminated in this garment, designed to transform a nobleman's daughter into a duchess. "You look absolutely radiant, Miss Isabella," whispered Martha, her voice thick with emotion as she carefully arranged the delicate veil over Isabella's chestnut hair. Martha had been with her since Isabella was 7 years old, and the maid's eyes glistened with maternal pride as she stepped back to admire her handiwork. Isabella studied her reflection with critical eyes. The woman who gazed back at her was poised and elegant, with features that were pleasant if not striking. A straight nose, clear grey eyes, and a mouth that naturally curved into a serious expression. Her chestnut hair had been arranged in an elaborate style beneath the veil, adorned with orange blossoms and small pearl pins. A modest application of rouge coloured her cheeks, and the slight tremble of her gloved hands was the only outward sign of her inner turmoil. Today marked the culmination of her 22 years of existence, the day Isabella Munro would finally become the Duchess of Richmond, fulfilling the destiny laid out for her before she could even speak her first word. "Thank you, Martha," she replied softly, touching the pearl necklace at her throat. A gift from the Duke sent that morning with a formal note expressing his anticipation of their union. "I have prepared for this day my entire life." Indeed she had. Since the moment her father, Lord William Munro, and the old Duke of Richmond had shaken hands over her cradle, sealing her fate with a marriage contract written on parchment and bound with the seals of both houses, Isabella had been moulded for this role. Every lesson, every skill she had acquired was meant to prepare her to stand beside one of England's most powerful dukes. She had mastered French by age 10, adding Italian and German by 15. She could play Beethoven's most challenging sonatas with technical perfection, if perhaps less passion than her music master might have wished. Her watercolor landscapes had been praised by Royal Academy artists, and she could recite from memory the complex hierarchies and subtle nuances of proper etiquette that governed aristocratic society. And somewhere along the years of preparation, the young girl's dutiful acceptance had blossomed into genuine affection. She had met Edward Richmond only a handful of times, always in strictly chaperoned settings, formal dinners, a garden party at his country estate, once at the opera in London, where he had commented favourably on her French. His dignified demeanour and occasional kind words had been enough for her romantic heart to weave elaborate dreams around. In the privacy of her journal, she had practised signing her new name, Isabella Richmond, Duchess of Richmond, the elegant script a testament to her hidden excitement. "The carriage awaits, miss," announced the butler Simmons from the doorway. His usually impassive face betrayed a hint of pride as he beheld the bride. "Lord Munro is ready to escort you." Isabella took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. Martha carefully draped the floor-length veil over her face, a symbolic barrier between the maiden she had been and the woman she was about to become. "You'll make a fine duchess, Miss Isabella," Martha whispered as she made a final adjustment to the train. "The finest Richmond has ever seen." The journey from the Munro estate to the Richmond Ancestral Chapel took 20 minutes by carriage. The morning fog had begun to lift, revealing glimpses of the lush April countryside coming into bloom. The Richmond Ancestral Chapel stood on a gentle hill overlooking the family's vast estate, its grey stone walls and Gothic spires dating back to the 15th century. As Isabella's carriage approached, she caught glimpses of England's most prestigious families entering the stone church. Ladies in their finest gowns and elaborate hats, gentlemen in formal morning attire with gleaming top hats and walking sticks, the cream of English society had gathered to witness the union of two great houses. Isabella's heart raced beneath her tightly laced corset. Through the carriage window, she saw the Duke of Wellington himself, hero of Waterloo, ascending the chapel steps. Cabinet ministers, peers of the realm, even distant royal cousins, all had come to see Isabella Munro fulfill the promise made at her birth. The carriage came to a stop before the chapel's ancient oak doors. Her father, Lord William Munro, a stern man of 50 whose business acumen had elevated their family's status beyond their relatively recent title, stood waiting to help her descend. His salt-and-pepper hair was impeccably groomed, his expression one of satisfaction rather than paternal affection. "Today you fulfill your duty to our family," he said, as he offered his arm, his usual greeting replacing any fatherly words of tenderness or pride. The marriage would cement the Munros' place in society, bringing their merchant wealth into the aristocratic fold through an alliance with one of England's oldest titles. "Yes, father," Isabella replied dutifully, though inside her heart sang with secret joy. For her, today was about more than duty or family advancement. It was about beginning her life with Edward, the man who had occupied her thoughts for years. The chapel doors swung open to reveal the interior, transformed by hundreds of white roses and burning tapers. The assembled guests, nearly 300 of England's elite, rose to their feet as the string quartet began the wedding march. The ancient stone walls seemed to hold their breath as Isabella took her first step down the aisle on her father's arm, her gaze fixed on Edward's broad shoulders at the altar ahead. He stood tall and proud in his formal attire, his aristocratic profile handsome against the backdrop of stained glass windows depicting his ancestors' military victories. The morning light filtered through the colored glass, casting a multicolored glow upon the scene. Isabella was halfway down the aisle when she noticed her 17-year-old sister Charlotte seated in the front row. The younger Munro daughter looked particularly lovely in a gown of pale blue silk that complemented her fair coloring, her golden curls arranged fashionably beneath a hat adorned with forget-me-nots. Charlotte caught her eye and smiled, but something in that smile, a knowing gleam perhaps, or a hint of secretive triumph, made Isabella's step falter momentarily. Lord Munro's grip on her arm tightened, urging her forward. The last few steps to the altar seemed to stretch endlessly as Isabella's heart pounded with anticipation. Finally, they reached the front of the chapel, where the elderly vicar waited with an open prayer book. Lord Munro placed Isabella's hand on the prayer book, symbolically giving his daughter to the church and to her husband. As Isabella took her place beside the groom, Edward finally turned to face her. She expected to see warmth in his eyes, perhaps even admiration as he beheld his bride for the first time on their wedding day. Instead, his expression was cold, distant, and determined. A chill that had nothing to do with the stone chapel's perpetual coolness ran through Isabella's veins. Before the vicar could speak the first words of the marriage service, Edward raised his hand in a gesture of interruption. "I must address the congregation," he announced, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent chapel. Isabella stood frozen, still clutching her bouquet of white roses, lilies, and myrtle. The scent of the flowers suddenly seemed cloying, overwhelming. "I cannot proceed with this union," Edward declared, each word falling like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled guests. Gasps and murmurs rose from the pews as fans fluttered with increased vigor. "I have come to realize that such an important decision as marriage must be based on more than mere agreements made in my infancy." Isabella felt the blood drain from her face as Edward stepped away from her side. The distance between them, merely inches in physical space, seemed to stretch into an unbridgeable chasm. "Miss Charlotte Munro," he continued, turning toward Isabella's younger sister, "has captured my heart with her vivacity and youth. It is she whom I wish to make my duchess." Charlotte rose from her seat in the front pew, a flush of triumph coloring her cheeks as she met Edward's gaze. The shock that rippled through the congregation was palpable. Ladies reached for their smelling salts, gentlemen exchanged glances of scandalized interest, and the vicar's prayer book slipped from his stunned fingers to land with a thud on the stone floor. But none of these reactions penetrated the fog of humiliation and betrayal that enveloped Isabella. The pain that stabbed through her heart was physical in its intensity, stealing her breath and blurring her vision. "This is outrageous," Lord Munro bellowed, stepping forward with his face contorted in fury. "We have a contract, Richmond, a binding agreement between our families." "A contract I am willing to honor financially," Edward replied coldly, turning to face his almost father-in-law with the confidence of a man whose title and wealth made him virtually untouchable. Double the dowry will be transferred to your accounts by week's end as compensation, but I will not bind myself for life to a woman when I prefer another. Even you, Lord Monroe, with your mercantile background, must understand the value of choosing the superior option when it presents itself. The deliberate reference to Lord Monroe's trading past, a source of both wealth and social insecurity, was a calculated insult that further inflamed the situation. Several of Lord Monroe's friends stepped forward in support, while the Richmond connections closed ranks around Edward. Isabella stood motionless amidst the growing chaos, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The pitying glances from the assembled guests, the furious flush on her father's face, Charlotte's barely concealed look of victory, all of it swirled around her in a nightmarish tableau from which there was no escape. "Isabella," Edward said, finally addressing her directly, his voice lowered so that only she and those nearest could hear. "You are an accomplished woman, and I'm certain you will make some gentleman a suitable wife. But your sister possesses the youth and spirit better suited to be my Duchess. I'm certain you understand the practical considerations." Practical considerations. As if her 22 years made her somehow less valuable than Charlotte's 17. As if the devotion she had cultivated, the skills she had perfected, the dreams she had nurtured meant nothing compared to her sister's pretty face and flirtatious manner. With dignity she hadn't known she possessed, Isabella handed her bouquet to Martha, who had rushed to her side from where the servants observed at the back of the chapel. "I understand perfectly, Your Grace," she replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the earthquake within. "You have made your preferences quite clear." She unfastened the pearl necklace from her throat, his gift delivered that very morning, and held it out to him. "I believe this belongs with your chosen Duchess." Edward looked momentarily disconcerted by her composure, perhaps having expected tears or pleading. He took the necklace automatically, seeming uncertain for the first time in the proceedings. Isabella then turned to Charlotte, who at least had the grace to lower her eyes momentarily. "I wish you joy of your choice, sister," she said, each word precise and controlled. "May it bring you all the happiness you deserve." The subtle emphasis on the last word was not lost on Charlotte, whose triumphant smile faltered slightly. With that, Isabella gathered her elaborate train over one arm and turned away from the altar. Head held high despite the tears threatening to spill, she walked back down the aisle, alone. The same path she had traveled moments before as a bride now became her route of retreat. Each step measured and dignified, despite the whispers that followed her like a poisonous fog. Jilted at the altar. For her own sister. At 22, practically on the shelf already. The Richmond curse strikes again. These fragments of gossip, which would soon spread throughout London society like wildfire, seemed to hang in the air around her. Isabella Monroe, who had always followed every rule, fulfilled every expectation, now found herself the central figure in what would undoubtedly become the scandal of the season. Outside, away from the curious eyes of society, Isabella finally allowed herself to stumble. The April sunlight seemed a mockery of the darkness that had descended upon her life. Her carefully cultivated composure, maintained through years of training in proper behavior, shattered as the enormity of the humiliation washed over her. "Miss Isabella," Martha called, rushing after her with a cloak to shield her from both the spring chill and prying eyes. "Please let me take you home." "Not home," Isabella managed through trembling lips, the first tears beginning to spill onto her cheeks. "I cannot face those walls right now, knowing how Father will look at me, as the daughter who failed in her only duty. Take me to Aunt Agatha's townhouse in London. She at least will understand what it means to be deemed insufficient by a man." Martha nodded, signaling frantically to the Monroe coachman, who had been waiting to transport the newly married couple to the wedding breakfast. He quickly brought the carriage around, helping Isabella inside while Martha shielded her from the first curious onlookers beginning to emerge from the chapel. As the carriage pulled away from the chapel, Isabella caught a final glimpse through the window of Edward and Charlotte standing together on the steps, already looking like the perfect ducal couple as the guests swarmed around them with renewed excitement. The scandal would be enormous, but Edward's title and Charlotte's youth and beauty would eventually smooth over the impropriety. Society always forgave the young, the beautiful, and the powerful. The life Isabella had prepared for since birth had been stripped away in an instant, leaving her adrift in a society that would forever define her by this rejection. The carefully arranged marriage that was to have been her crowning achievement had become her greatest humiliation. The skills she had acquired to be the perfect duchess now seemed as useless as a ship's sail in a desert. At 22, Isabella Munro had become a cautionary tale, the woman rejected by the Duke of Richmond, abandoned at the altar for her younger sister. And as the carriage rattled over the country roads toward London, toward the uncertain sanctuary of her aunt's home, she had no idea how to begin again. The journey to London stretched before her like her new future, unknown, unplanned, and terrifying in its emptiness. The wedding gown that had been designed to mark her transformation into a duchess now felt like a costume, its weight and restriction a physical manifestation of the expectations that had confined her life until this moment. As the Richmond estate disappeared behind them, Isabella allowed herself something she had never permitted before, the freedom to weep openly, with the abandonment of a woman who had lost everything she had been raised to value. In that carriage, racing away from her shattered dreams, Isabella Munro began the painful process of discovering who she might become when all her careful preparation proved worthless, and the path laid out for her since birth suddenly vanished beneath her feet. The carriage journey from Richmond Estate to London was a blur of green countryside, gradually giving way to the sprawling metropolis. Isabella sat in numb silence, her wedding gown a cruel reminder of all she had lost. As London's buildings began to appear, the reality of her situation settled upon her shoulders like a physical weight. She was no longer a bride-to-be, no longer the future Duchess of Richmond. She was now something far worse in Victorian society, a woman rejected, an object of pity and gossip. By the time the carriage rolled onto the cobblestones of Grosvenor Square, Isabella had composed her exterior, though her heart still thundered with pain and humiliation. Martha helped straighten her veil and wiped away the traces of tears, though nothing could be done about her reddened eyes. "Remember, miss, you've done nothing wrong," Martha whispered as the carriage came to a stop. "Hold your head high." Aunt Agatha's London townhouse stood as a dignified testament to refined independence, its white Portland stone facade and black wrought iron railings setting it apart from its neighbours. Unlike most women of her station, Lady Agatha Harcourt had never married, choosing instead to live by her own means after inheriting a substantial fortune from her father. At 62, she had long since ceased to care about society's whispers regarding her unmarried state. The carriage door opened, and Isabella found herself face to face with Aunt Agatha herself, who had apparently been watching from her drawing-room window. Tall and angular, with silver hair arranged in an unfashionably simple style, Lady Agatha Harcourt cut an imposing figure on her doorstep. Her sharp eyes took in Isabella's wedding attire, the carriage devoid of wedding guests, and her niece's devastated expression. With the quick intelligence that had allowed her to navigate society on her own terms for decades, she pieced together the situation immediately. "Absolutely disgraceful," Aunt Agatha declared, not waiting for an explanation as she helped Isabella from the carriage. "Edward Richmond always was an opportunistic cad, just like his father before him. The old Duke tried to court me once, you know, before settling for his cousin's fortune instead." The elderly woman's outrage on her behalf provided the first balm to Isabella's wounded heart. At least someone believed the fault lay with Edward, not with her supposed inadequacies. "Come, child," Aunt Agatha continued, leading Isabella inside with a protective arm around her waist. "What you need is a change of clothes, a pot of strong tea, and the knowledge that this humiliation will eventually pass. Jenkins," she addressed her butler, "have the blue guest chamber prepared for Miss Munro. She will be staying with us indefinitely." The butler, a dignified man who had served Lady Agatha for 20 years, merely nodded as if brides appearing on the doorstep in full wedding attire was a common occurrence. "Yes, my lady. And shall I have cook prepare a light luncheon?" "Indeed, and bring a tray of tea to my private sitting room immediately," Aunt Agatha instructed, as she guided Isabella up the marble staircase. Once in the privacy of Aunt Agatha's sitting room, with its comfortable furnishings and walls lined with books rather than the fashionable silk wallpaper found in most Mayfair homes, Isabella finally allowed her rigid posture to crumble. How can I ever face society again? She whispered, removing her veil with trembling hands. All of London will know by evening that Edward Richmond rejected me at the altar for Charlotte. How can it pass, Aunt? Isabella whispered, finally allowing her composure to crumble completely. All of London witnessed my rejection. I am ruined. Ruined? Aunt Agatha scoffed, removing her spectacles to polish them vigorously. Hardly. You are merely freed from a most unfortunate match. In time you'll see this as the blessing it truly is. A blessing? Isabella's voice rose in disbelief. To be humiliated before all of society. To watch my sister take the position I was raised to fill. How can you possibly call that a blessing? Because I have lived long enough to recognize prison cells, even when they're gilded with ducal coronets, her aunt replied calmly. Tell me truthfully, Isabella, did you love Edward Richmond? Not the idea of him, not the role he represented, but the man himself. The question caught Isabella off guard. She had spent so many years preparing to be Edward's Duchess that she had rarely considered the man apart from his title. I thought I did, she said slowly, but I barely knew him. We were never permitted more than a few minutes of conversation, always supervised. Precisely, Aunt Agatha said with a decisive nod. You were being sold into a marriage with a stranger, a handsome stranger with an impressive title, certainly, but a stranger nonetheless. And based on his actions today, a rather contemptible one at that. Isabella couldn't argue with that assessment, though the wound was still too fresh to find comfort in it. But what am I to do now? I've been trained for one purpose since infancy, to be the Duchess of Richmond. Without that future, I have nothing. Nonsense, Aunt Agatha said firmly, as a maid entered with the tea tray. You have a first-rate education, a sharp mind, and the freedom to discover who Isabella Munro might be, beyond the role that was assigned to her. She poured the steaming tea into delicate porcelain cups. Besides, you have me, and unlike your father, I value you for more than your marriageability. In the days that followed, Isabella retreated into the sanctuary of her aunt's vast library. Row upon row of leather-bound volumes offered escape from the reality of her situation, from the letters of sympathy that arrived daily, from her father's terse note announcing that Charlotte and Edward would marry within the month, from the gossip that undoubtedly circulated through every drawing-room in London. The library became her refuge, its oak shelves towering from floor to ceiling, filled with everything from ancient philosophy to modern novels. Here Isabella could lose herself for hours, curled in the window seat that overlooked the small but exquisitely maintained garden behind the townhouse. Between pages of Austen, Shelley, and Byron, Isabella found temporary solace. Books demanded nothing of her, no perfect posture, no flawless French pronunciation, no practiced smiles. They simply offered their worlds without judgment. One rainy afternoon, a week after what society had taken to calling the Richmond incident, Isabella was deeply engrossed in Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman when Aunt Agatha entered the library with unusual excitement. You cannot hide among these dusty tomes forever, my dear, she announced, pulling open the heavy curtains to let what little daylight penetrated the London rain clouds flood the room. The Spanish Duke of Mendoza has arrived in London on diplomatic business, and I have secured us invitations to Lady Pembroke's literary salon this evening, where he will be in attendance. Isabella looked up from her book with a frown. I have no desire to be paraded before another duke, Aunt, nor do I wish to face society's pitying glances so soon. This is not about finding you another match, Aunt Agatha insisted, seating herself in the leather armchair opposite Isabella's window seat. It is about showing London that Isabella Munro is neither broken nor in hiding. Besides, the Duke is known to be quite the intellectual. Lady Pembroke tells me he has translated several works of Shakespeare into Spanish himself. Isabella closed her book, keeping her finger between the pages to mark her place. I appreciate your concern, Aunt, but I'm not ready to face society. The humiliation is still too fresh. And it will remain fresh if you continue to nurture it in isolation, Aunt Agatha replied, with the directness that had always characterized her speech. I'm not suggesting you attend a grand ball or the opera, where you would be the center of attention. Lady Pembroke's salon is a small gathering of intellectuals and literary-minded aristocrats, precisely the sort of people who value conversation over gossip. Isabella hesitated, her natural inclination to withdraw warring with the growing tedium of her self-imposed isolation. What would I even wear? I brought nothing with me except my wedding clothes. Aunt Agatha smiled, recognizing the question as tentative acceptance. I've already instructed my dressmaker to send over several ready-made gowns that can be quickly altered to fit you. Nothing extravagant, simple, elegant attire suitable for a young woman of quality who values substance over ostentation. Despite her reluctance, Isabella found herself dressed in a simple gown of deep blue silk that evening, its modest cut and minimal embellishment a stark contrast to the elaborate wedding dress that now lay wrapped in tissue paper in the back of her wardrobe. Aunt Agatha had been insistent, and in truth Isabella was beginning to tire of her own company and melancholy thoughts. Lady Pembroke's salon was held in the tastefully appointed drawing-room of her townhouse on Berkeley Square. Unlike the glittering balls of the season, where hundreds of guests crowded into ballrooms under blazing chandeliers, the salon was mercifully intimate. Only 20 guests gathered to discuss literature and ideas rather than gossip and marriage prospects. Still, Isabella felt the weight of curious glances as she entered the room on her aunt's arm. Her story had undoubtedly reached every ear in London by now, embellished with each retelling. She kept her chin high, drawing on reserves of dignity she hadn't known she possessed. "Lady Harcourt, Miss Munro." Lady Pembroke greeted them warmly, a kindness in her eyes that suggested genuine sympathy rather than morbid curiosity. In her 50s, with a reputation as a blue-stocking tempered by impeccable social credentials, Lady Pembroke was known for her literary interests and her disinclination toward malicious gossip. "How delightful that you could join us. We are discussing the merits of the Romantic poets this evening. Mr. Wordsworth's latest publication has sparked quite the debate." Isabella nodded politely, steeling herself against the inevitable whispers. To her surprise, however, most guests seemed genuinely engaged in the literary debate rather than in her scandal. Perhaps Aunt Agatha had been right about this particular gathering. She found herself drawn into a conversation about Byron's Childe Harold with an elderly professor from Oxford and a middle-aged woman who had published several volumes of poetry under a male pseudonym. The discussion was stimulating, requiring enough concentration that Isabella momentarily forgot her personal troubles. "Señorita, may I offer a different perspective on Lord Byron's work?" The deep voice with its distinct Spanish accent came from behind her. Isabella turned to find herself looking up into the most striking face she had ever encountered. The man who addressed her stood tall with olive skin, intelligent dark eyes and features that appeared to have been sculpted by a Renaissance master. His formal attire was impeccably tailored, but subtly different from English fashion. The cut more continental, the fabric richer in texture. "Your Grace," Lady Pembroke said, appearing at Isabella's side with remarkable speed, "allow me to present Miss Isabella Munro and her aunt, Lady Agatha Harcourt. Ladies, His Grace, Alejandro de Mendoza, Duke of Valencia." "The honor is mine," the Duke said, bowing elegantly. Unlike most English aristocrats, who treated such gestures as perfunctory social requirements, there was a fluid grace to his movement that suggested genuine respect. "I could not help overhearing your defense of Byron's Childe Harold. Your insights were most compelling." Isabella felt color rise to her cheeks. After weeks of being the subject of pitying glances and whispered conversations, to be addressed as an intellectual equal was unexpectedly refreshing. "You are too kind, Your Grace. I merely suggested that his portrayal of disillusionment speaks to universal human experience rather than mere personal indulgence, as Professor Harrington contends." "Precisely why it resonates across cultures," Alejandro agreed, his dark eyes lighting with intellectual engagement. "In Spain, we too understand the beauty of melancholy, what we call la tristeza dulce." "Sweet sadness," Isabella translated softly. The Duke's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You speak Spanish, Miss Munro?" "Only a little," she admitted. "I focused more on French and Italian in my studies, but I've always been fascinated by languages." "Still impressive," he said with a smile that transformed his serious face, revealing a slight dimple in his left cheek. "Perhaps you might help me better understand some of your English idioms during my stay in London. I find myself frequently confused by your curious expressions." For the first time since her wedding day, Isabella felt the ghost of a genuine smile touch her lips. "I would be happy to assist, Your Grace, though I warn you that English is filled with contradictions." "As are most worthwhile things in life," he replied, his dark eyes holding hers for a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed. The conversation shifted to the Duke's diplomatic mission, negotiations regarding Spanish wine imports following recent changes in English tariffs, but maintained an intellectual quality that Isabella found engaging. Unlike the superficial exchanges she was accustomed to with English gentlemen, who rarely discussed serious matters with young ladies, the Duke spoke to her as if her opinions had genuine value. In Madrid, ladies frequently participate in political discussions, he explained, when she expressed surprise at his willingness to discuss trade policy with her. My own mother served as an unofficial advisor to the royal court on matters of international relations. I find the English custom of relegating women to discussions of weather and fashion rather limiting. Many English ladies would agree with you, Your Grace, Isabella replied, though few English gentlemen seem to share your perspective. As the evening progressed, Isabella found herself engaged in the most stimulating conversation she had experienced in years. The Duke was not only well-read, but possessed a perspective entirely different from the London gentleman she had known. He spoke of literature as something lived rather than merely studied, and listened to her opinions with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. I must confess, Miss Munro, he said as the gathering began to disperse, when I agreed to attend this salon, I expected polite academic discussion. I did not expect to find a kindred spirit. Nor did I, Isabella admitted. It has been refreshing. Perhaps you would consider showing me the British Museum tomorrow, he asked. I am told their collection of classical antiquities is unrivaled, and I would value a knowledgeable companion. Before Isabella could respond, Aunt Agatha appeared at her side, having observed the extended conversation with evident satisfaction. My niece would be delighted, Your Grace, she declared. Shall we say 11 o'clock? I would, of course, accompany them as chaperone. I would be honored, the Duke replied, bowing over Lady Agatha's hand. Until tomorrow, then, ladies. Later, as their carriage rolled back toward Grosvenor Square, through the gas-lit London streets, Isabella turned to her aunt. That was rather presumptuous of you, Aunt. Nonsense, Aunt Agatha replied with a satisfied smile. I merely accepted an invitation that you were clearly inclined to accept yourself. Besides, did you not notice how every lady in that room envied your extended conversation with the handsome Duke? Lady Harrington's daughter looked positively green with jealousy. I am not interested in making anyone envious, Isabella said firmly. Nor am I looking for another attachment so soon after. After being fortunate enough to escape marriage to that unprincipled Richmond boy, Aunt Agatha finished for her. The Duke of Mendoza seems a man of genuine character and intellect. I'm not suggesting you marry him, my dear, merely that you allow yourself to remember there are worthwhile men in this world, men who see value beyond youth and a pretty face. Isabella turned to gaze out the carriage window at the gas-lit streets of London, the evening fog giving the lamps a ghostly halo. For the first time since her humiliation, she had passed an evening without dwelling on Edward's rejection or Charlotte's betrayal. The Duke's interest had been in her mind, her thoughts, not in her family connections or her suitability as a duchess. He didn't mention it, you know, she said softly. The scandal. He must have heard, everyone has, but he spoke to me as if you were a woman of intelligence and substance rather than merely a jilted bride, Aunt Agatha suggested. Perhaps because that is precisely what he saw. The carriage turned onto Grosvenor Square, the horses' hooves echoing on the cobblestones. As they approached Aunt Agatha's townhouse, Isabella felt something stir within her, not happiness, precisely, but a tentative curiosity about what the future might hold. Perhaps Aunt Agatha was right. Perhaps it was time to step back into the world, not as the woman rejected by the Duke of Richmond, but simply as Isabella Munro, with her own thoughts, her own interests, and possibly her own future. That night, for the first time since the wedding day, Isabella slept without dreaming of the chapel and Edward's cold eyes. Instead, her dreams were filled with the British Museum's marble halls and a voice with a Spanish accent discussing Byron's poetry. When she woke, the heavy weight of humiliation had lightened just slightly, making room for something she had not expected to feel again so soon: anticipation. As she stood at her bedroom window, watching the morning light gradually illuminate London's rooftops, Isabella realized that the path forward, though uncertain and unplanned, might hold possibilities she had never considered when her future seemed so rigidly predetermined. She rang for Martha to help her dress for the day. "The blue walking dress, I think," she instructed, "and my hair in a simpler style than yesterday. We're going to the British Museum." "Yes, miss," Martha replied, unable to hide her pleasure at seeing her mistress taking an interest in her appearance again. "And might I say you look better this morning? There's some colour in your cheeks." Isabella caught her own reflection in the looking-glass and was surprised to see that Martha was right. The hollow-eyed ghost who had haunted her aunt's guest room for the past weeks had begun to recede, replaced by a woman with a spark of life returning to her grey eyes. "It's just a museum visit, Martha," she cautioned, not wanting to acknowledge even to herself that she was looking forward to seeing the Spanish Duke again. "An educational outing, nothing more." "Of course, miss," Martha agreed, though her knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. As she arranged Isabella's hair in a fashionable but understated style, she added, "Still, it's good to see you interested in something again. That's all I meant." By the time 11 o'clock approached, Isabella found herself standing in the entrance hall, outwardly composed but inwardly nervous in a way that had nothing to do with the prospect of facing society again. The Duke of Valencia had awakened something in her that she had thought permanently extinguished by Edward's rejection: curiosity about another person, and perhaps more surprisingly, curiosity about herself. When the door knocker sounded precisely at 11, Isabella smoothed her skirts and took a deep breath. Whatever happened next, whether this outing led to friendship, something more, or nothing at all, she was, for the first time in her life, facing a day that had not been mapped out for her since birth. There was terror in such freedom, certainly, but also an exhilarating sense of possibility. The butler opened the door to reveal Alejandro de Mendoza, Duke of Valencia, standing on the doorstep in mourning attire, his carriage waiting at the curb. As he bowed over her hand in greeting, his dark eyes met hers with what seemed like genuine pleasure at seeing her again. "Miss Monroe," he said, his accented voice somehow transforming her ordinary name into something melodic. "I have been looking forward to our expedition." "As have I, Your Grace," Isabella replied, surprised to discover that she meant it. Behind her, Aunt Agatha descended the stairs, ready for her role as chaperone, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she observed the way the Duke looked at her niece. As they stepped out into the spring sunshine, Isabella realized that for the first time since that terrible day at the Richmond Chapel, she was looking forward rather than back. The woman who had been rejected at the altar was beginning to recede, making way for a woman she was only just starting to discover, Isabella Munro, not as she had been molded to be, but as she might choose to become. The visit to the British Museum marked the beginning of a transformation in Isabella's life. What began as a simple cultural outing evolved into a series of encounters that gradually rekindled her spirit. As April's showers gave way to May's gentle sunshine, Isabella found herself stepping further from the shadow of her humiliation and into a life she had never imagined possible. Over the following weeks, London society observed with growing interest as Miss Isabella Munro was frequently seen in the company of the Spanish Duke. Their outings, always properly chaperoned by Lady Harcourt, became the subject of speculation in drawing rooms across Mayfair. The very society that had pitied Isabella now watched with curiosity as she appeared at select gatherings with the distinguished foreigner at her side. What began with their visit to the British Museum expanded to afternoons in the Royal Botanical Gardens, attendance at the Royal Academy's exhibition, and even a musical performance at St. James's Hall. To Isabella's surprise, each encounter deepened her appreciation for Alejandro's character and intellect. Unlike Edward, who had barely spoken 10 sentences to her during their entire acquaintance, Alejandro seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts. He asked questions about her opinions on everything from politics to poetry, and actually listened to her answers. More surprising still, he often deferred to her knowledge on matters of English culture and history, treating her as an intellectual equal rather than a decorative companion. One particularly fine May afternoon found them strolling through Kew Gardens, with Aunt Agatha following at a discreet distance. The spring blooms were at their peak, filling the air with fragrance and painting the landscape in vibrant colors that seemed to reflect Isabella's gradually reawakening spirit. In Spain, Alejandro told her as they paused beside a particularly beautiful arrangement of exotic flowers, we have a saying, "Más vale buen entendimiento que grandes riquezas." A good understanding is worth more than great riches. "That's lovely," Isabella replied, watching a butterfly alight on a nearby bloom. "Though I imagine many in English society would disagree, as would many in Spanish society," Alejandro admitted with a wry smile that transformed his serious features. "The nobility is not so different across borders, I'm afraid. We are all taught to value lineage and fortune above character. And yet, you seem to have escaped that particular lesson, Your Grace," Isabella observed, noting how he had greeted the gardener's children with the same courtesy he showed to the royal botanist they had encountered earlier. "Perhaps because I learned early that titles offer no protection against life's tragedies," he said, his expression growing serious. "My parents died when I was 14, a boating accident off the coast of Valencia. I inherited the dukedom far too young, with only my grandfather's guidance to see me through." "I'm so sorry," Isabella said softly, touched by this glimpse into his past. In their many conversations, he had shared little about his personal history, focusing instead on ideas and observations. "It shaped me," Alejandro continued, absently twirling a fallen blossom between his fingers. "Made me understand that life is unpredictable and precious. We must seize happiness where we find it, not where convention dictates it should be." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, passing beneath a trellis heavy with climbing roses. The scent enveloped them, sweet and intoxicating in the warm afternoon air. "May I be bold, Miss Munro?" Alejandro asked suddenly, pausing beneath the canopy of blossoms. Isabella felt her heart quicken. "You may. I know of your recent situation," he said carefully. "London talks of little else, I'm afraid, but I want you to know that I see it as the Duke of Richmond's great misfortune, not yours." Isabella stopped walking, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Of course he knew. Everyone knew. She had foolishly begun to hope that perhaps he had somehow missed the gossip, or that he didn't care about it. But now the humiliation she had gradually been setting aside threatened to engulf her once more. "You need not offer kind falsehoods, Your Grace," she said stiffly, retreating behind the polite mask she had perfected over years of training. "I am well aware of how society views a rejected bride." "I offer no falsehoods," Alejandro replied firmly, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Only my own observation that a man who would humiliate a woman of your intelligence and grace reveals his own profound lack of judgment, not yours." His words, spoken with such conviction, broke through a barrier Isabella hadn't realized she'd built. For weeks, she had carried the unspoken belief that she must somehow have been lacking, too plain, too serious, too old at 22 compared to Charlotte's 17 years. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking back unexpected tears. Alejandro reached for her gloved hand, a gesture that would have been improper had Aunt Agatha not been distracted by an exotic plant several yards away. "In Spain, we also believe that sometimes fate leads us through darkness, only to reveal a brighter path," he said softly. "Perhaps your Richmond was merely an obstacle on your true journey." The warmth of his hand through her glove sent an unfamiliar but not unwelcome sensation through Isabella. She should withdraw her hand, propriety demanded it, but for once she allowed herself to defy convention. They stood thus for a moment, connected by that simple touch, while butterflies danced around the roses above them, and London society seemed very far away. The following day, Isabella was still dwelling on that moment in the garden, when Jenkins, Aunt Agatha's butler, entered the library where she had been attempting to read. "A letter for you, miss," he announced, presenting it on a silver salver. Isabella recognized the handwriting immediately, her mother's elegant script. With trepidation, she broke the seal, wondering what news from home awaited her. The letter began with familiar formalities, but quickly came to its purpose. The Countess of Harrington was hosting her annual grand ball the following evening, and Lady Munro expected Isabella to attend with Aunt Agatha. More concerning still, the letter mentioned that Edward and Charlotte would be there, their first public appearance as husband and wife since their hastily arranged wedding 2 weeks prior. "I cannot possibly attend," Isabella told her aunt over luncheon, placing the letter beside her plate. "They will be there, as husband and wife." "Precisely why you must go," Aunt Agatha insisted, setting down her fork with a decisive click against fine porcelain. "If you hide away, you confirm every whisper that you are devastated beyond recovery. Besides," she added with a knowing smile, I have it on good authority that the Duke of Mendoza will be in attendance. How do you know that? Isabella asked, surprised. Because I took the liberty of ensuring he received an invitation, her aunt replied unapologetically. Lady Harrington and I have been friends since we were girls. She was quite amenable to adding the Spanish envoy to her guest list, especially when I mentioned his interest in English customs. Isabella shook her head at her aunt's transparent matchmaking. Even if he attends, I'm not certain I can face Edward and Charlotte together. The humiliation is still too raw. My dear, Aunt Agatha said, her voice gentler than usual, there will always be a reason to avoid facing them if you search for one. But consider this. Would you rather they believe they've broken your spirit, or would you prefer to show them that Isabella Munro is made of stronger stuff than they imagined? That evening, Isabella stood before her mirror, examining her reflection with critical eyes. Her gown was new, a creation of deep crimson silk that Aunt Agatha had insisted upon, claiming that Isabella had worn enough pastel colors to last a lifetime. Bold, not black for mourning, nor white for innocence, her aunt had declared when the dressmaker presented the design. A color that announces your transformation. The woman reflected back at Isabella barely resembled the bride who had stood in white just weeks earlier. There was a new awareness in her eyes, a slight lift to her chin that spoke of emerging strength rather than practiced poise. The crimson silk complemented her chestnut hair and fair skin, making her appear more vivid, more present than the watercolor pastels she had always worn as the dutiful daughter. When they arrived at Harrington House, Isabella took a steadying breath before entering the ballroom. The grand space glittered with hundreds of candles, illuminating London's elite in their finest attire. The moment she appeared in the doorway on Aunt Agatha's arm, conversations faltered and heads turned in her direction. "Courage, my dear," Aunt Agatha murmured. "Remember who you are becoming, not who you were told to be." Isabella nodded, scanning the room until her eyes found what they unconsciously sought. Alejandro standing near a column, his formal attire distinctly Spanish in cut and style. When he saw her, his face lit with a smile that somehow made the whispers around them fade into insignificance. He crossed the room to bow before her. "Miss Munro, you are a vision tonight." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied, suddenly aware of every eye upon them, of the assessment and speculation taking place behind fans and raised champagne glasses. "Would you do me the honor of reserving the first waltz for me?" he asked. Before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through her consciousness. "Isabella, how unexpected to see you here." Edward Richmond stood before her, Charlotte on his arm. Her sister was resplendent in a gown of pale green silk, her golden curls arranged elaborately beneath a diamond tiara, the Richmond family heirloom that should have adorned Isabella's head. Isabella felt as if all the air had been pulled from the room. This was the moment she had dreaded, the confrontation she had imagined in countless restless nights. Yet now that it had arrived, she was surprised to find herself steadier than expected. "Your Grace," Isabella responded with perfect composure, dropping into a flawless curtsy. "Duchess, I trust married life agrees with you both." Edward had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, while Charlotte merely tightened her grip on his arm, her triumphant smile barely concealed. "Indeed," Edward replied stiffly. "London has been abuzz with talk of your friendship with the Spanish Duke." Isabella felt Alejandro stiffen beside her. "Allow me to make introductions," she said smoothly. "Your Grace, may I present Alejandro de Mendoza, Duke of Valencia, Your Grace the Duke and Duchess of Richmond." The men exchanged terse bows, sizing each other up with the wariness of natural rivals. The contrast between them was striking. Edward, fair and classically English with his golden hair and blue eyes. Alejandro, dark and intense, with the unmistakable pride of Spanish nobility evident in his bearing. "I understand congratulations are in order," Alejandro said, his Spanish accent more pronounced than usual. "Though I confess, English marriage customs continue to surprise me. In Spain, we consider a man's word his bond, especially in matters of honor." The subtle rebuke was not lost on anyone present. Edward's face flushed, a muscle twitching in his jaw. "I assure you, Your Grace, that English honor is no less stringent. Sometimes circumstances require adaptations." "How fascinating," Alejandro replied with dangerous politeness. "In my country we have another saying, el hombre que cambia de opinión como de camisa No merece confianza ni en la misa. The man who changes his mind as often as his shirt deserves trust, not even at Mass. Charlotte's eyes narrowed. Perhaps some Spanish lessons would improve your English, Your Grace. Your accent makes understanding difficult. Charlotte, Edward murmured warningly. Isabella felt a surge of unexpected strength. The sister who had betrayed her, the man who had humiliated her, they suddenly seemed smaller than she remembered, less intimidating. His Grace speaks 5 languages fluently, Duchess. How many do you speak now? Charlotte's face flushed with anger. But before she could respond, the orchestra began the opening notes of a waltz. I believe this is our dance, Miss Monroe, Alejandro said, offering his arm. As he led her onto the floor, Isabella felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The couple they left behind no longer held power over her happiness. Whatever pain they had caused remained, but its sting had lessened. You handled that with remarkable grace, Alejandro murmured as they took their positions for the waltz. I had an excellent example of dignity before me, she replied, nodding toward him. As they moved across the floor, Isabella became aware of something shifting within her. A final release of the life she had been prepared for, and an opening to possibilities she had never permitted herself to imagine. The gaze of society followed them, noting how well they moved together, how the Spanish Duke looked at his partner with undisguised admiration. There is something I must tell you, Alejandro said as they waltzed through the crowded ballroom. My diplomatic mission concludes at the end of this month. I will be returning to Spain. Isabella felt a sharp pang of disappointment. So soon? Yes, he confirmed. But before I go, there is something I must ask you. The music swelled around them as he guided her through the steps with confident ease. Other couples danced around them, but for Isabella, they might as well have been alone. In these weeks I have come to admire you greatly, Isabella, he continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Your intelligence, your resilience, your gentle heart. I find myself unable to contemplate returning to Spain without knowing if you might consider a future there. Isabella nearly missed a step. Your Grace, are you suggesting— I am suggesting nothing yet, he interrupted gently. Only asking if you might be open to the possibility of a life very different from the one you had planned. Spain is not England. Valencia is not Richmond. And I am not the man you were promised to since birth. No, Isabella agreed, a smile touching her lips. You are nothing like him, thank heaven. Alejandro's eyes widened at her response, then crinkled with pleasure. Does that mean you might consider my offer? I believe it means I would like to hear more about this offer, Isabella replied, surprising herself with her boldness. Perhaps tomorrow, in the park. As the waltz ended, Alejandro bowed over her hand. Tomorrow, then. For the remainder of the evening, Isabella moved through the ballroom with a new lightness. She noted the speculative glances, heard the whispers that followed her, saw Edward watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. None of it mattered. For the first time in her life, Isabella Monroe was contemplating a future shaped by her own choices rather than by agreements made over her cradle. Later, as the carriage carried them back to Grosvenor Square, Aunt Agatha observed her niece with satisfaction. You seem different tonight, she remarked. More present. I feel different, Isabella admitted, as if I've stepped out of a role I've been playing all my life. And how does it feel, this freedom? Her aunt asked. Isabella considered the question. Terrifying, she said honestly, and exhilarating. The best things often are, Aunt Agatha replied with a knowing smile. That night, as Isabella prepared for bed, she found herself drawn to the window. The London sky was unusually clear, with stars visible despite the city's gas lamps. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay Spain, a country she had studied but never visited, a place as foreign to her as the concept of choosing her own path had been just weeks ago. Valencia, she whispered, testing the name on her tongue. The word itself sounded like freedom, like possibility. As Martha helped her out of her crimson gown, Isabella caught sight of her reflection once more. The woman who gazed back at her from the mirror was neither the bride rejected at the altar, nor the perfect duchess in training she had been raised to be. This was someone new emerging, Isabella Monroe, discovering herself for the first time. You seem happy tonight, miss, Martha observed as she brushed out Isabella's hair. It's good to see. Do I? Isabella asked, genuinely surprised. I'm not certain happy is the right word, but I feel alive, as if I've been sleepwalking all these years and have finally awakened. The following morning dawned bright and clear, as if London had decided to put aside its usual grey demeanour in honour of the decision Isabella faced. As she prepared for her walk in Hyde Park with Alejandro, she found her thoughts unusually serene. Their meeting was set for 11 o'clock, and Isabella found herself ready well before the appointed hour, dressed in a walking ensemble of deep blue that complemented her eyes. She paced the drawing room, rehearsing possible responses to what she suspected would be a formal proposal. "You seem remarkably composed for a woman about to receive a proposal," Aunt Agatha observed as she entered the room, her perceptive eyes missing nothing. "We don't know that's what he intends," Isabella reminded her aunt, though her heart quickened at the possibility. "Don't we?" Aunt Agatha raised an eyebrow. "The man has called upon you nearly every day for 3 weeks, and looks at you as though you've personally hung the moon and stars. If that isn't a man on the verge of a proposal, I've misread every romance since King George was in short pants." Isabella smiled at her aunt's characteristically blunt assessment. "Even if you're right, I'm not certain what my answer should be. Spain is so far away, and so different from everything I know." "Which might be precisely what you need," her aunt replied thoughtfully, settling into her favourite armchair. "You were moulded since infancy to be the perfect English Duchess. Perhaps it's time to discover who Isabella Munro might become when freed from those expectations." "But what about you?" Isabella asked. "What about my family?" "I have survived 62 years quite successfully on my own," Aunt Agatha replied dryly. "I dare say I can manage without you, though I would miss you terribly. As for your family, Carson," she hesitated, "your father sees you primarily as a failed investment, and your sister has betrayed you in the most personal way imaginable. Perhaps distance from them would not be entirely unwelcome." Before Isabella could respond, Jenkins announced the arrival of the Duke of Valencia. Isabella smoothed her skirts, took a deep breath, and prepared to face a future she had never imagined. When Alejandro entered the drawing room, Isabella was struck once again by how his presence affected her. It wasn't merely his handsome features or his title. She had been raised among handsome aristocrats all her life. Rather, it was the quality of his attention, the sense that when he spoke with her she was truly seen. "Miss Munro," he said, bowing over her hand. "Lady Harcourt, you both look radiant this morning." "Flattery will get you everywhere, Your Grace," Aunt Agatha replied with unusual warmth. "Now, shall we proceed to the park? I understand it's particularly lovely this time of year." They walked through Hyde Park at a leisurely pace, Aunt Agatha maintaining a discreet distance behind them. Close enough for propriety, far enough for private conversation. The park was filled with fashionable Londoners taking their morning exercise, many of whom observed the trio with undisguised curiosity. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Isabella began when they reached a secluded bend in the path overlooking the Serpentine. "And I have been thinking of little else," Alejandro admitted. "Perhaps I was too forward. If so, No," Isabella interrupted gently. "You weren't too forward. In fact, your honesty has been refreshing. All my life, I've lived with careful words and hidden meanings. You speak directly, and I value that more than I can express." Alejandro smiled, visibly relieved. "Then may I continue to be direct?" When Isabella nodded, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather case. "This belonged to my mother," he said, opening it to reveal an exquisite ring, a deep blue sapphire surrounded by diamonds. "In Spain, we consider sapphires symbols of loyalty and truth, values I have found abundantly in you, Isabella." He took her hand, his expression solemn yet filled with warmth. "I did not come to England seeking a bride. I came on diplomatic business, expecting nothing more than tedious negotiations and formal dinners. Instead, I found a woman of extraordinary character, intelligent, kind, and stronger than even she knows." Isabella felt tears gathering in her eyes as he continued. "I know this is sudden. I know Spain is not your home and that my proposal comes at a time when you are still healing from betrayal. But I also know with a certainty I cannot explain that you are the woman I wish to share my life with." He knelt before her, there on the gravel path, heedless of his immaculate trousers. "Isabella Munro, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Not because of arrangements made in your childhood, but because we choose each other freely as equals. Time seemed to still around them, the gentle lap of water against the lake shore, the distant calls of children playing. The rustle of leaves overhead all faded into insignificance as Isabella looked into the eyes of the man before her. In that moment of perfect clarity, Isabella realized that the answer had been forming within her heart since their first meeting. Alejandro had entered her life when she believed herself defined by rejection, and had instead helped her discover her own worth beyond the role she had been raised to fill. The woman who had been betrayed at the altar was not the same woman who stood in the park today. In just a few short weeks, Isabella had begun to shed the layers of conditioning that had shaped her entire existence. With Alejandro, she glimpsed the possibility of a life built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than duty and social expectation. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, I will marry you, Alejandro." His face transformed with joy as he rose to slip the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand alone. "For you have made me the happiest of men," he said, raising her gloved hand to his lips. From behind them came the sound of applause. Aunt Agatha, abandoning all pretense of not eavesdropping, approached with a broad smile. "Well done, Your Grace," she declared. "I was beginning to fear I'd need to drop more obvious hints." "Aunt," Isabella protested, blushing furiously. "What? I'm an old woman with no time for unnecessary delays," Aunt Agatha replied unapologetically. "Now shall we discuss wedding plans? I suggest a small, elegant ceremony before you depart for Spain. No sense giving the gossips more time to wag their tongues." As they walked back through the park, arm in arm, Isabella was conscious of the curious glances directed their way. By evening, all of London would know that the woman rejected by one duke had captured the heart of another, more distinguished one. The narrative was too romantic, too satisfying for even the most cynical socialites to resist. But for Isabella, the true story was far more significant than any gossip could capture. In choosing Alejandro, and in being chosen by him, she had taken the first step toward defining herself on her own terms. The journey ahead would lead her far from the path that had been laid out for her since birth, across oceans to a land she had never seen. Yet as she looked up at the man beside her, she felt not fear but anticipation. The life awaiting her in Spain was unknown, but it would be her own, a life chosen rather than assigned, a future built on love rather than duty. As they reached the park gates, Isabella caught sight of a familiar carriage passing by, the Richmond crest emblazoned on its door. Through the window she glimpsed Edward's profile, his attention focused on some document in his hands, unaware of her presence. A month ago, such an encounter would have filled her with pain and humiliation. Today, she felt only a faint echo of those emotions, overshadowed by gratitude. Had Edward not rejected her, she would never have discovered her own strength. Had he not chosen Charlotte, Isabella would never have found Alejandro. Sometimes, she reflected as they continued their walk, what appears to be a cruel twist of fate is merely the beginning of a better story. The news of Isabella Munro's engagement to the Spanish Duke spread through London society with remarkable speed. By evening, every drawing room buzzed with the story, how the woman rejected by one duke had captured the heart of another, more distinguished one. The narrative was too romantic, too satisfying for even the most cynical socialites to resist. Even the Morning Post carried a small announcement the following day, noting the fortuitous alliance between an esteemed English family and Spanish nobility. For Isabella, however, the days following her engagement existed in a separate reality from society's gossip. Each morning brought a fresh awareness of the sapphire that now adorned her hand, not a symbol of duty, like the pearls Edward had given her on their wedding day, but a token of genuine affection and mutual choice. Lord Munro, upon receiving Alejandro's formal request for Isabella's hand, responded with characteristic pragmatism. "A Spanish dukedom is certainly acceptable," he wrote in his reply, delivered by messenger to Aunt Agatha's townhouse, "though I trust the financial arrangements will be thoroughly documented before any ceremony takes place." Isabella read her father's letter with a mixture of amusement and resignation. "He hasn't changed," she told Alejandro as they sat together in Aunt Agatha's drawing room, reviewing their plans for the small wedding that would take place before their departure for Spain. Everything remains a transaction to him. Then we must be grateful that our marriage will be something far more meaningful, Alejandro replied, his hand covering hers. In Spain, we have a tradition of las arras matrimoniales, 13 gold coins the groom gives to the bride during the ceremony, symbolizing his commitment to her welfare. I would give you 13,000 if it meant securing your happiness, but I suspect your happiness cannot be purchased with gold. No, Isabella agreed softly. It cannot. Though I confess I'm curious about all the Spanish traditions we'll incorporate into our ceremony. We will blend the best of both our cultures, Alejandro promised, just as we will in our life together. The wedding preparations proceeded with remarkable speed, guided by Aunt Agatha's efficient hand. A small ceremony at St. George's in Hanover Square was arranged for the first week of June, allowing just enough time for a proper announcement and the gathering of necessary documents, but not so long that London society would have excessive opportunity to speculate or interfere. A month is rather quick, Isabella had worried when Aunt Agatha first proposed the timeline. Nonsense, her aunt had replied. It's perfectly respectable for a woman of your age, particularly given the circumstances. Besides, the Duke's diplomatic duties require his return to Spain. Would you prefer a long engagement, conducted primarily through correspondence? Isabella had to admit she would not. After spending her entire life waiting to fulfill a predetermined destiny, the idea of further delay held little appeal. As the wedding day approached, Isabella found herself settling into a strange new reality. Her days were filled with preparations, selecting a modest but elegant trousseau suitable for the Spanish climate, studying books about her future home, and practicing her Spanish with Alejandro's patient guidance. Her evenings often included small social gatherings where she and her fiancé were the objects of intense curiosity and, increasingly, genuine good wishes. "You seem happy," observed Lady Pembroke during one such gathering, a musical evening at which Isabella had just performed a Spanish folk song that Alejandro had taught her. "Genuinely happy, not merely resigned or composed." "I am," Isabella replied, surprised by the realization. "I never expected to find such joy after that Richmond boy's foolishness," Lady Pembroke supplied when Isabella hesitated. "My dear, sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as disappointments. I suspect in 10 years' time you'll look back on that day at the altar as the most fortunate escape of your life." 3 days before their wedding, scheduled as a modest ceremony at St. George's in Hanover Square, an unexpected visitor arrived at Lady Harcourt's townhouse. "The Duke of Richmond requests an audience with Miss Munro," the butler announced with evident disapproval. Isabella, who had been reviewing Spanish phrases with Alejandro's patient guidance, looked up in surprise. "Edward is here?" "Alone," the butler confirmed with a significant glance. Isabella exchanged a look with her aunt, who nodded grimly. "Show him into the small parlour, Simmons. I shall receive him there." "Are you certain?" Alejandro asked, concern evident in his expression. "I could accompany you." "No," Isabella decided after a moment's consideration. "This is a conversation I need to have alone, to properly close that chapter of my life." Alejandro's dark eyes searched hers. "As you wish, but I will be close by if you need me." Isabella touched his cheek gently. "I know. That makes all the difference." Edward stood stiffly by the window when Isabella entered the parlour, his back to the door as he gazed out at the square. The afternoon sun illuminated his golden hair and broad shoulders, the same figure that had once dominated her dreams and expectations. He turned at the sound of the door, and she was struck by how diminished he seemed compared to her memories. Still handsome, still aristocratic, but somehow less imposing than the man who had occupied her imagination for years. "Isabella," he began, then corrected himself. "Miss Munro, thank you for agreeing to see me." "What brings you here, Your Grace?" Isabella asked, maintaining a polite distance. She deliberately kept her left hand with Alejandro's sapphire ring visible as she clasped her hands before her. Edward's eyes flickered to the ring before returning to her face. "I've come to offer my congratulations on your engagement. The Duke of Valencia is well respected in diplomatic circles." "Thank you," Isabella replied simply. "Though I doubt you came merely to convey congratulations that could have been expressed at any social gathering." A flicker of the old Edward, imperious, slightly impatient, crossed his face before he mastered it. "No, I wanted to speak with you privately, to explain—" "There's no need," Isabella interrupted gently. "Your actions at our wedding were explanation enough." "Were they?" Edward challenged, a hint of the entitled young man she had once idealized creeping into his tone. "Do you truly understand why I made that choice?" Isabella studied him, seeing for the first time the insecurity beneath his aristocratic bearing. Edward Richmond, Duke of Richmond, had never in his life had to explain himself to anyone, especially not to a woman. That he felt compelled to seek her out to justify his actions revealed more about his character than any explanation he might offer. "I believe I do," she said calmly. Charlotte was younger, more vivacious, perhaps more biddable. She represented a better opportunity to secure your bloodline with numerous heirs, a practical choice for a man concerned primarily with practical matters. Edward looked taken aback. "You've changed," he observed. "Yes," Isabella agreed simply. "I have." A silence stretched between them, filled with all that could not be said. How his rejection had broken her, how she had rebuilt herself into someone stronger, how that strength had allowed her to recognize a love far deeper than anything she had imagined feeling for him. "I did not come to justify my actions," Edward said after an awkward pause. "I came because Charlotte is not well. The transition to duchesshood has been difficult for her. She struggles with the responsibilities, the expectations." Isabella felt a pang of sympathy for her sister, despite everything. Charlotte had been raised as the pretty, charming younger daughter, never expected to shoulder the burdens that Isabella had been trained for since birth. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I fail to see how this concerns me." "You were trained for that role your entire life," Edward said, a note of desperation entering his voice. "You would have managed it flawlessly. I realize now that perhaps I acted hastily." The implication hung in the air between them. Isabella regarded him with newfound clarity. "Are you suggesting that you regret your choice?" she asked quietly. Edward did not answer directly. "I merely wish to convey that your abilities were perhaps undervalued." Isabella felt a surge of emotion, not the heartbreak or vindication she might once have expected, but a profound sense of closure. "3 months ago those words would have meant everything to me," she said softly. "Today they mean nothing at all. I wish you and Charlotte every happiness, Edward, truly, but my future lies elsewhere." She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "Perhaps you might try seeing Charlotte as more than a young, pretty bride. She has strengths of her own, different from mine. If you look for them, you might find a true partner rather than merely a duchess." Edward stared at her, astonishment evident in his features. "You've become quite philosophical, Isabella." "Not philosophical," she corrected him with a small smile. "Simply wiser about what truly matters in life. Good day, Your Grace." As she closed the door behind her, Isabella felt the last weight of her former life lift from her shoulders. In the drawing room, she found Alejandro waiting anxiously with Aunt Agatha, who made no pretense of disinterest in the unexpected visit. "All is well?" Alejandro asked, searching her face. "All is perfect," she assured him, taking his hands in hers. "I am exactly where I am meant to be." The morning of Isabella's wedding dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself approved of the union about to take place. Unlike the elaborate preparations for her first wedding, this morning was marked by a calm intimacy. Martha helped her into a simple gown of ivory silk, new with no associations to her previous wedding, while Aunt Agatha supervised the arrangement of orange blossoms in her hair. No veil this time, Isabella had decided. "I want nothing hidden between us." St. George's, Hanover Square, was modestly filled with a select group of London's elite, Aunt Agatha's friends, a few diplomatic associates of Alejandro's, and a small representation from the Monroe family. Lord and Lady Monroe sat stiffly in the front pew, their expressions a mixture of resignation and calculation. Charlotte was conspicuously absent, having pleaded a sudden illness that prevented her attendance. As the organ played, Isabella walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her steps sure and her heart steady. Unlike the first time she had traversed this path, today she moved not toward a stranger and a duty, but toward a man she had chosen and who had chosen her. Alejandro waited at the altar, his dark eyes never leaving her face as she approached. When Lord Monroe placed her hand in his, Isabella felt not the transfer of property from one man to another, but the joining of equals embarking on a shared journey. The ceremony proceeded without interruption or hesitation. When the priest asked, "Who giveth this woman to be married to this man?" Lord Munro answered with formal correctness, but Isabella knew the truth. She gave herself, freely and with clear eyes. As she spoke her vows in the sunlit church, her gaze never left Alejandro's face, the face of a man who had chosen her for herself, not for duty or bloodlines or social expectations. When he slipped the gold band onto her finger to join the sapphire engagement ring, his hands were steady and warm. "With this ring I thee wed," he said in his accented English, then added softly in Spanish, "Con este anillo te entrego mi corazón y mi vida." With this ring I give you my heart and my life. After the ceremony, a small reception was held at Aunt Agatha's townhouse. As Isabella moved among the guests on her husband's arm, the word still new and wonderful in her mind, she caught her father's eye across the room. Lord Munro raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement, his expression inscrutable. It was as close to a blessing as she would receive from him, and Isabella found that it was enough. "Are you happy, my dear?" Aunt Agatha asked, as the reception drew to a close. "More than I ever imagined possible," Isabella replied honestly. "Then my work here is done," her aunt declared with satisfaction, "though I shall expect detailed letters from Spain, and perhaps a visit when you've settled in." "You will always be welcome," Alejandro assured her, bowing over the elderly woman's hand. "Without you, I might never have found my Duchess." "Oh, you would have found her," Aunt Agatha replied with a knowing smile. "Some things are simply meant to be." 3 days later, Isabella Munro, now Isabella de Mendoza, Duchess of Valencia, stood on the deck of the ship that would carry them to Spain. The English coastline was gradually receding behind them, growing smaller with each passing minute. As their ship sailed from England's shores toward the sun-drenched coasts of Spain, Isabella stood on the deck beside her husband, watching her homeland fade into the distance. The June breeze carried the scent of salt and promise, ruffling the loose tendrils of hair that had escaped her bonnet. "Any regrets?" Alejandro asked softly, his arm secure around her waist. Isabella turned to look at him, this man who had recognized her worth when she had nearly forgotten it herself. In the weeks since their first meeting, she had discovered in him not only a keen intellect and honorable character, but a tenderness that had helped heal the wounds of her humiliation. "None," she replied with perfect honesty. "England was my past. You are my future." As the ship caught the wind and surged forward toward the Mediterranean, Isabella felt a profound sense of peace. The path that had seemed so fixed from her infancy had taken an unexpected turn, leading her not to the life she had been prepared for, but to the one she was meant to live. The southern Spanish sun would be different from London's gentle light. The language, customs, and expectations of her new homeland would challenge her in ways she had never anticipated. But with Alejandro by her side, Isabella faced this new chapter not with fear, but with excitement. She had entered the world as a girl promised to a duke since birth. She left England as a woman who had chosen her own destiny. And in that choice, Isabella Munro, now Isabella de Mendoza, Duchess of Valencia, had found not just love, but her true self. The voyage to Spain took 8 days, during which Isabella discovered she had an unexpected affinity for sea travel. While many of the passengers remained in their cabins, suffering from seasickness, she spent hours on deck, fascinated by the ever-changing face of the ocean and the vast expanse of sky above them. "You would have made a fine explorer in another life," Alejandro observed as they stood at the rail one evening, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. "Perhaps in this life I still can be," Isabella replied. "There is an entire country waiting for me to discover it." Alejandro smiled, pulling her closer. "And I shall be your guide, though I warn you, once you've seen Valencia, you may never wish to leave." "Tell me about our home," Isabella requested, leaning into his embrace. "You've described the palace and the grounds, but what of the people? What of our daily life there?" As twilight deepened around them, Alejandro painted a picture of their future with words. The ancient stone walls of the Palacio de Mendoza overlooking the Mediterranean, the orange groves that filled the air with fragrance in spring, the staff who had served his family for generations and would welcome her as their new duchess. "My steward Rodrigo has been with us since before I was born," he told her. "His wife Elena runs the household. They have been preparing for your arrival with great enthusiasm. I believe Elena has already planned menus for the first month to introduce you to Spanish cuisine gradually. They sound wonderful, Isabella said, touched by the thought of strangers taking such care for her comfort. They are family, Alejandro corrected gently, as you will be. In Spain, the bonds between noble houses and those who serve them run deeper than in England. Generations of Mendozas and generations of their people, living and working together through war and peace, prosperity and hardship. On the final day of their voyage, the Spanish coastline appeared on the horizon, a golden line beneath a brilliant blue sky. As they drew closer, Isabella could make out the port city of Valencia, its ancient walls and towers gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Welcome to Spain, my love," Alejandro murmured, his arm around her waist as they stood at the ship's rail. "Welcome home." The word resonated within her. Home. Not the home she had been raised in, nor the Richmond estate she had been prepared to preside over, but a new home of her own choosing. As the ship maneuvered into the harbor, Isabella felt a surge of anticipation and joy. On the dock, a welcoming party awaited them. Alejandro's younger brother, Miguel, several local officials, and a contingent of servants in the Mendoza livery. The greeting was warm and effusive, with rapid Spanish that challenged Isabella's still developing comprehension. "They are saying how beautiful you are," Alejandro translated, as they rode in an open carriage through the city streets toward the Mendoza palace. "And how fortunate I am to have found an English rose to bring to Spanish soil." Isabella smiled, taking in the sights and sounds of her new home. The narrow streets with their balconied buildings, the markets filled with produce she had never seen in England, the cathedral spires rising against the blue sky. Everything was bathed in a golden light that seemed to make colors more vivid, sounds more musical, life itself more intense than in the muted grays of London. The Palacio de Mendoza stood on a hill overlooking the city and the sea beyond, its golden stone walls gleaming in the late afternoon sun. As their carriage passed through the massive iron gates and into a courtyard filled with fountains and orange trees, Isabella felt a sense of rightness, of belonging that surprised her. "What do you think?" Alejandro asked, watching her face as she took in the palace that would now be her home. "It's beautiful," Isabella replied honestly. "More beautiful than I imagined." A line of servants stood waiting to greet them, headed by an elderly couple, Rodrigo and Elena, the steward and housekeeper Alejandro had spoken of. They welcomed Isabella with formal bows and warm smiles, their Spanish slow and clear for her benefit. That evening, as she prepared for her first dinner as the Duchess of Valencia, Isabella stood on the balcony of their private apartments, looking out over the Mediterranean. The setting sun turned the water to molten gold, while fishing boats returned to harbor with their day's catch. "Are you happy?" Alejandro asked, joining her at the railing. Isabella turned to him, this man who had entered her life when all seemed lost and had shown her a world of possibilities she had never imagined. "Profoundly," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "I never thought I could feel this way, so free, so alive." "That is all I wish for you," he said, drawing her into his arms. "To be happy, to be yourself, not the woman someone else decided you should be, but the woman you choose to become." As twilight deepened into night, the stars emerged above them, the same stars that shone over England, but somehow brighter, more numerous in the clear Spanish sky. Isabella thought of the path that had brought her here, of the heartbreak that had ultimately led to joy. Edward's rejection, which had once seemed the end of her world, had merely been the beginning of a better story. Charlotte's betrayal had freed her from a life that would have confined her to a role rather than allowing her to become a person in her own right. She had entered the world as a girl promised to a duke since birth. She had left England as a woman who had chosen her own destiny. And in that choice, Isabella Munro, now Isabella de Mendoza, Duchess of Valencia, had found not just love, but her true self. 6 months later, the Palacio de Mendoza stood resplendent against the azure Mediterranean sky, its golden stone walls catching the warm afternoon light. From the terrace garden where Isabella sat sketching, she could see fishing boats dotting the bay below, their white sails bright against the deep blue water. 6 months in Valencia had transformed her in ways she could scarcely have imagined when she left England's shores. Her skin had taken on a golden hue from the Spanish sun, her once perfect English rose complexion replaced by a healthier glow. Her Spanish, once halting and formal, now flowed more naturally as she conversed with servants, local dignitaries, and the villagers who had welcomed their duke's English bride with unexpected warmth. "Working on another landscape, my love?" Alejandro's voice came from behind her as he emerged from the palace, loosening his cravat in the afternoon heat. Isabella smiled up at her husband. "Not today. I'm writing to Aunt Agatha." He settled beside her on the stone bench, glancing at the lengthy letter filled with her neat handwriting. "And how is the formidable Lady Harcourt?" "Thriving as always," Isabella replied with a fond smile. "She writes that she's considering visiting us next spring. Apparently London society has grown tediously predictable in my absence." Alejandro chuckled. "I look forward to it. Your aunt's observations on Spanish customs will undoubtedly be entertaining." Isabella set aside her writing. "She also sent news of the Richmonds." "Did she?" Alejandro's tone remained neutral, but his eyes betrayed his interest. "Charlotte is with child," Isabella said, "due in the summer. And apparently she has surprised everyone by taking a keen interest in the management of the Richmond estates. Aunt writes that she's quite transformed from the flighty girl she once was." "And how does this news make you feel?" Alejandro asked gently. Isabella considered the question honestly. "Happy for her," she said finally. "Truly happy. We were both shaped by our father's ambitions, though in different ways. Perhaps Charlotte, like me, simply needed the freedom to discover her own strengths." Alejandro reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over the sapphire ring that now shared her finger with a wedding band of Spanish gold. "You have a generous heart, Isabella." "I have a full one," she corrected him with a smile. "It's easier to be generous when one wants for nothing." A servant approached, bowing respectfully. "Your Graces, the delegation from Madrid has arrived." "Thank you, Miguel," Alejandro replied. "Please show them to the library. We will join them shortly." As the servant departed, Isabella rose to prepare for their guests. The king's representatives had come to discuss Alejandro's proposals for modernizing Valencia's harbors, a project he had developed with Isabella's unexpected but valuable input. "Ready to astonish the king's men with your insights on maritime commerce?" Alejandro asked with a proud smile. "I believe so," Isabella replied confidently. In England, her education had been focused on making her an ornamental duchess, accomplished in arts and languages, but never in matters of true substance. Here in Spain, Alejandro had encouraged her to apply her intelligence to practical matters, valuing her perspective on everything from agricultural improvements to diplomatic relations. As they walked arm in arm through the sunlit corridors of the palace that was now her home, Isabella reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. The humiliation that had once seemed unbearable had become, in retrospect, the first step toward a happiness she could never have found as the Duchess of Richmond. "Sometimes," she said softly to Alejandro as they paused before the library doors, "I think about that day at the altar when Edward chose Charlotte, and I find myself wanting to thank him." "Thank him?" Alejandro asked, surprised. Isabella nodded, her eyes filled with love as she looked at her husband. "His rejection set me free to find you. And in finding you, I found myself." Alejandro raised her hand to his lips. "Then I too must be grateful to the Duke of Richmond for his profound lack of judgment that brought the most precious treasure in the world to my shores." With the Mediterranean sun streaming through the ancient windows of their ancestral home, the Duke and Duchess of Valencia entered the library together, equals in partnership, united in purpose, and bound by a love that had been chosen freely rather than dictated by duty. And in that choice lay all the difference. The end, dear listener. Sometimes life places us on unexpected paths, moments when everything we planned seems to crumble. Like Isabella, you too may be facing your own version of an empty altar or a broken promise. But remember, the destiny others have mapped out for us isn't always the one that will bring us true happiness. Often it's precisely in our moments of greatest pain that the doors to our true purpose open. Perhaps today you're feeling the weight of rejection, the sting of betrayal, or simply the exhaustion of following expectations that aren't truly yours. Know that this pain isn't the end of your story. It's merely a necessary chapter for your transformation. Just as Isabella found the strength to rebuild her identity and discover a deeper, more authentic love, you too carry within you a resilience you may not yet know. Your moments of greatest vulnerability can become the foundation of your greatest strength. Rest tonight knowing that tomorrow brings new possibilities. Allow yourself to release the reins of control for a few hours, trusting that you are protected and supported by the universe. Your body deserves rest, your mind deserves peace, and when the sun rises again, remember, you are not defined by the plans others made for you, but by the choices you yourself make each new day. As the Duchess of Valencia discovered, sometimes our greatest gifts come disguised as our greatest disappointments. I thank you for your company on this journey of discovery and renewal. May your dreams be sweet and your awakening full of purpose. With profound gratitude, Legends of the Fall. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end. Please like, comment, and share this story if it touched your heart. Subscribe to our channel and support us from the bottom of your heart. Your support gives us the strength to continue creating stories filled with love, redemption, and unforgettable twists.